You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. Today on the BMI podcast, we're going to talk about cortisol. We've all heard a lot about cortisol and its effect as a stress hormone and the elevated levels and the detriment that it can do to our bodies. But exactly how and why that is, we're going to go into. And it's interesting, cortisol at therapeutic levels sort of behaves in one way, and cortisol at elevated or chronically elevated levels tends to behave in a very different way, oftentimes in the exact opposite way. What is cortisol? Well, cortisol is really the principal stress hormone in our body. And it has a lot of influence over a lot of different processes. It's the primary glucocorticoid that is actually made from the adrenal glands. As we spoke in last week's podcast, there's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? The HPA axis. And if you remember, the hypothalamus is a part of the brain and it regulates a lot of things, but appetite and stress, there's just a lot of things that are regulated through the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes an enzyme called corticotropin-releasing hormone, which then acts on the pituitary. And the pituitary is a little gland in our brain. And then the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone. That then releases cortisol. When cortisol is released, it influences a lot of different processes, but metabolism is one of them. It also has control over sort of what we call cardiovascular tone, how we process glucose and carbohydrates, how we break down protein, what we do with fat, and different processes within metabolism. And like I said, sometimes it works in one way under sort of normal levels, but then oftentimes works in a completely different way. So basically, I want to start with the effects that it has on carbohydrate metabolism. Remember, we always talk about how carbs are sort of the enemy, and you can't live without carbs. And definitely if you're exercising a lot or running or biking or doing something like you have to have carbs, right? It's your easiest source of energy. But in the typical American diet or the typical Western diet, we eat way too many carbs, particularly these highly processed carbs. And so that's where it becomes a problem. But when we eat carbohydrates, right, we've talked about eat the carbohydrates, it breaks it down into sugars, your insulin level goes up. So then when you have elevated cortisol levels, you have kind of this chronic elevated blood sugar. That's one of the detriments of cortisol. And it does it in multiple ways. So one of the things it does is it actually inhibits insulin production at least a little bit. And then when you inhibit the insulin production, then your body is signaled and you have this feedback loop that then causes you to secrete more insulin. So then you end up hyperinsulinemic, right? Your insulin levels are just chronically elevated. And you also can end up with what we call beta cell apoptosis. So apoptosis is a programmed cell death. And beta cells are, of course, the cells in the pancreas that secrete insulin. One of the ways that elevated cortisol levels causes us problems is it has sort of an antagonistic effect on insulin, and it causes this chronically elevated insulin level. And we've talked ad nauseum about the effect of that. Additionally, cortisol reduces your ability to take up and utilize glucose, particularly in the muscles and in your fat cells. And then it sort of has this permissive effect on glucagon. Remember, glucagon is the hormone opposite of insulin. And so then that facilitates chronically elevated blood sugar. Remember, when you eat carbohydrates and you have elevated sugars, insulin level goes up to drive those down. But when your blood sugars are low, glucagon raises your blood sugar, right? It stimulates gluconeogenesis, the process of breaking down stored glycogen in the liver and in the skeletal muscle to raise your blood sugar. And so cortisol has an effect on that. So you can see where cortisol has multiple effects where it raises blood sugar and in turn raises insulin levels, which then goes back to the problems that we spoke about so much with elevated insulin levels. So what role does cortisol have in protein metabolism? Well, cortisol induces a catabolic effect in skeletal muscle, which remember, catabolic is the breakdown of, as opposed to an anabolic effect, which is the buildup of. So insulin is more anabolic and cortisol is more catabolic. And what it does is it stimulates this proteolysis, the breakdown of proteins, and inhibits protein synthesis. And so you can see when cortisol has this effect, it is catabolic. It's breaking things down. It also suppresses pathways by inhibiting mTOR. Remember, we spoke about mTOR 2 or 3 episodes ago, the mechanistic target of rapamycin. So by having elevated cortisol levels in the end, you basically have a sustained decrease in protein synthesis and to some extent a sustained increase in protein breakdown. So then that leads us to the third component of what role does cortisol have in fat tissue and lipid metabolism. So bear with me on this a little bit because it seems beneficial in the short run, but if you just kind of listen as I go through this. So elevated cortisol levels lead to reduced subcutaneous fat. So subcutaneous fat is the fat like on your arms or even just right there on your belly or on your legs, wherever, your butt, you just kind of pinch it. Subcutaneous just means under the skin, right? So the fat there is very different than what we call visceral fat, which is the fat that's inside our belly and really makes up that abdominal girth. And it's really a much more dangerous fat. We've talked a little bit about, brown fat and white fat and the roles that they have. Of course, brown fat's different. It's brown because of the increased mitochondria. Fat cells are truly an organ in and of themselves in that they secrete hormones and they have a metabolic process that is otherwise unlike other cells. So it has its own neurohormonal effects, fat does. The elevated cortisol level really promotes the fat cell differentiation and the production and the formation of fat cells. But what it does is it increases lipolysis. So you think, well, okay, that's good, right? You're breaking down fat. So having elevated cortisol levels increases lipolysis. That's good. That's one of the things that elevated insulin levels inhibits. Your insulin levels go up, it stops your body's ability to break down fat. But what I'm saying here is elevated cortisol levels increases lipolysis. So what that does then is that leads to reduced subcutaneous fat, right? The healthier fat, so to speak, and it increases your visceral fat, the visceral adiposity. It's not entirely clear why that is, but it seems like the receptors for cortisol in visceral fat are much more sensitized to the elevated cortisol levels, which then causes more lipogenesis, more of the production of that visceral fat, which remember, as we talked about, is the bad fat, so to speak. So that's a brief overview of how elevated cortisol levels affects carbohydrate, protein, and fat. It also has significant other effects like on skin, connective tissue, bone metabolism, definitely on fluid electrolytes, even blood pressure regulation. It has multiple effects, and it even has a big effect on immunologic issues. Glucocorticoids like cortisol are super effective in managing inflammatory processes short term. If you have let's just say an allergic reaction or you have an inflammatory bowel disease, right? We put people on these steroids and it really calms things down almost immediately. But over time, when you do that, you actually immunosuppress patients and you can really get into problems if you're on chronic steroid use. And then there's also a condition called Cushing syndrome where you just make too much cortisol. You just have this functional hypercortisolemia, which is very different than just having chronic elevations of cortisol just because of high stress and poor sleep and poor diet. That's a general overview of what we see with elevated cortisol levels. And so what happens in patients that have this chronic elevated cortisol, they functionally run around with elevated blood sugars and in turn elevated insulin levels, which is very similar to all the different processes that we've seen that have caused that. When you have that, in theory, you should have sort of a negative feedback loop, right? As your cortisol levels go up, there should be this feedback that tells the hypothalamus, hey, we got plenty of cortisol, and then it doesn't secrete as much corticotropin releasing hormone, which then tells the anterior pituitary not to release so much ACTH, and then tells the adrenal glands not to release the cortisol. But oftentimes with these chronic elevations, right, you become immune to that. And so you just have continued chronic elevations that then lead to elevated blood sugars, as we talked about, and elevated insulin levels. Now, let me differentiate that just a little bit. Let me go back to this Cushing's syndrome, the hypercortisolemia. So these patients have oftentimes either a pituitary tumor or some source in their body that's secreting cortisol. And that's very different. So I don't want you to mistake chronic elevated cortisol levels from a disease. The opposite of Cushing's syndrome is what we call Addison's disease, right? And it's hypocortisolism. It's the primary adrenal insufficiency. And it usually results from an autoimmune process that attacks the adrenal glands. Other things that can cause it are, tumors and infections. But those patients often manifest with fatigue, weight loss. They can actually have low blood pressure because remember, cortisol has a way of regulating sodium and potassium and actually has some control over our blood pressure as well. And oftentimes patients with hypocortisolism or adrenal glands will have hyperpigmentation. I believe President Kennedy had Addison's disease, but I don't know that for a fact, but it seemed like I read that. And he definitely had that bronzing of the skin. So what do you do to help normalize your cortisol levels? Well, for one, you have to work to minimize the stressors in your life, right? Psychological and to some extent physical. Now, if you're exercising extremely hard with, high intensity, high volume exercise, that can elevate your cortisol levels as well. And so when we say exercise, it's fine to do high intensity, HIIT exercising, high volume, but just recognize that it's not something you necessarily want to chronically sustain. And in patients that are like chronic runners or bikers or people who are just very active, maybe to excess, it could be postulated that they probably do have elevated cortisol levels throughout, and they can suffer some of the consequences over time of that chronic inflammatory state. Maybe it's offset by the degree of exercise, but maybe it's not. But you can see in patients who aren't getting a lot of exercise, but they have these elevated cortisol levels, you can see that the antagonistic effect that it has on insulin and the chronic elevated insulin levels, elevated blood sugars, and all the consequences of that can sure have a detrimental effect, particularly in combination with a lack of exercise. So what do you do? Well, first thing you can do is try to regulate your sleep, right? Try to get the best sleep that you can, about 7 to 9 hours. People who don't sleep well are known to have elevated cortisol levels. The other thing is cortisol is secreted sort of on a diurnal variation, right? It's very much regulated by the day. And so you have like a slight rise in cortisol levels early in the morning. That's why oftentimes patients have heart attacks early in the morning, is because there's a little bump in cortisol and all of the processes that go along with that. And then if you can avoid screens, not only while you're sleeping, but for the hours before that, that will really help you. Because when you begin to shut down, right, you secrete melatonin, and the melatonin helps you sleep, and it helps you with this whole process, right? Everything is so interconnected. When we were cavemen roaming the earth and the sun went down, well, that was it. And so much of our circadian rhythm is based on light, right? So as the light went down, then we begin to shut down and eventually would go to sleep, right? Wouldn't necessarily go to bed, but go to rock or, whatever it is you're sleeping on. Now we basically have light until the time that we shut it off. And so if you're staying up late looking at screens, whether it be a TV screen, a computer, a phone, an iPad, whatever it is, and you're getting all of that blue light and you have all that stimulation, when you go to sleep, you shut the light off. Well, it's not like the circadian rhythm can just adapt to that just immediately. So over time, our body has just kind of become adapted to longer days, but 7 to 9 hours of sleep, ideal temperature 69, and then just really try to get to bed at a consistent time and wake up at a consistent time. So that part, maintaining a good sleep hygiene, will help with cortisol levels. How about a diet? What can we do for diet? Well, of course, the best thing you can do for diet is just eat whole foods. Try to avoid so much of the ultra-processed foods, particularly foods with high sugars or high carbs. If you can eat healthy fats like olive oil, fish, avocados, these things will help to stabilize your blood sugar as well. Avoid eating late at night. Avoid caffeine. Ideally, don't take caffeine after 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then there are certain medications, of course, that can raise cortisol levels as well. Birth control pills are one of them that's common. And of course, if you're on steroids, that also can do it as well. In addition to the good sleep habits and the diet that we've discussed, exercise, routine exercise and movement is beneficial for management of cortisol levels. And like we talked about, the high intensity and even to some extent moderate intensity exercise, although there's a lot of benefit and it shouldn't be cut out, maybe minimize that or at least keep it in mind that elevated cortisol levels and inflammation are associated with high intensity exercise. You want to make sure that if you do that, that it's targeted with, what you feel are appropriate parameters that you're getting benefit from it. Some people are just addicted to exercise and they think every time they go out, they just really have to hit it at 100%. And we know that that's really not true, nor is it particularly beneficial. So moderate exercise can help to stabilize blood sugar and just really, stabilize your insulin levels and your cortisol levels. And so, that's particularly talking about walking yoga, even things like, deep breathing. And then also just things that help you to relax, hobbies that you like, friendships, volunteering, counseling, doing things with people. All of these things are really known to help decrease cortisol levels as well. So when you look at these things that we've discussed, good sleep hygiene, moderate exercise or movement, a healthy diet, social relationships, they're all very similar to what we saw in the blue zones, right? Remember the blue zones were those 5 areas across the globe that had a disproportionate number of people that lived to be 100 or more. And so the commonalities that the blue zones had when Buettner drilled down on that was he found that natural movement, a plant-based diet, strong social connections, and daily routines that reduce stress all were part of it. An ikigai or a purpose, right? Having a clear reason or a purpose for living. The moai that they had in the blue zones with the Okinawans, where they had a group of people, I think it was usually a group of 5 that they were assigned at birth that were basically just there to create a built-in social circle. These people grew up together, and it was sort of designed as a support group, but it just lasted for decades into the 8th, 9th, 10th decades. Probably very similar to siblings, but different in that they were just socially connected from birth. My point is the things that lower cortisol that we've talked about, again, diet, exercise, movement, and social connection, those are the things that we see as commonalities with people in the blue zones who disproportionately live to be 100. There's probably some connection there. To my knowledge, Buettner and his group didn't do any sort of blood work on people in the blue zones. But if you looked at it, maybe they do have lower cortisol levels. Because clearly the things that we know we can do to manage our cortisol levels are very similar to those things that we see that the people just naturally do in the blue zones, right? They're not intentionally doing those. It's not like they're taught to do those. It's just how they live their life. It's just their social norms. And those social norms tend to be healthier and appear to lead to longevity. That's all I have on cortisol. It's complex, and this is a very broad overview. If you have any insight on this, I'd love to speak with you or even have you on the podcast for more information on this. But you can see the role that cortisol plays, and it's interesting to watch as we dig down on these things. There's so many different levels that factor in to our homeostasis, right? Just the balance of our physiological life or our physiologic being. You think that, eating a little snack at 8 o'clock at night doesn't matter. But when you look at all of the things that it does, right? It messes with cortisol, messes with insulin, elevates blood sugar, interferes with sleep. You can see how we've gotten off kilter. The lights are on till we go to bed, right? And then the screens are probably on a little bit after that. And it affects our sleep. And then our sleep affects our cortisol, and our cortisol is antagonistic to our insulin. There's a lot to it. I always say we don't want to say that obesity is the individual's fault, right? But we also want to reflect personally and make sure that we understand that the choices that we make, whether it's, obesity or any other issue, that we do have those choices. But when you look at it, when you just look at the way society's designed, right? It's designed for ease. It's designed for comfort. It's designed for cheap food, cheap processed food. Ultimately, you're still responsible for the decisions you make. And unfortunately or fortunately, you're ultimately responsible for the consequences that you get. It is much more complicated than one would think. Hopefully the BMI is helping to shine light on this and everybody's gaining some benefit. So that's all I have on cortisol. I'm looking forward to next week's episode. I'm going to talk about the marathon that we went and ran in Eugene. It was a lot of fun, and I think it's going to be an interesting podcast for everybody to hear. So I look forward to it. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then.